And we are live with episode 6 of the Temper Shift podcast. Took a bit of a hiatus, had to step back a little bit, recharge my batteries, but we're back with a very, very special guest. We have a 3 times Contenders champion with us today, shot caller extraordinaire, two-way main support for the Philadelphia Fusion, who is obviously gracious enough to spare some of his time out of a very busy schedule. How are you doing, Elk?
I'm doing pretty good. It's 3 p.m. here, and none of my team is awake yet, so it's great.
Nice, great. So you're an early riser at 3 p.m.
Yeah.
So the way I usually want to do these, because obviously you are in Korea, that's very, very interesting. The fact that you made your way there, you're competing Contenders Korea, a lot of things to discuss and kind of unpack there. But I want to start like I usually do at the beginning of the season and kind of go through your journey to where you are now, talk a little bit about Philly Fusion, coming into Al and things like that. So the logical part, I think, the logical point, rather, I think, to start is you sign with the Philadelphia Fusion. You ink that contract. Obviously, something you've been working towards for a very, very, very long time. Uh, what were sort of your expectations heading into the year, both as a team and as an individual? Because you were coming into a team that made the finals the previous year, so obviously a very strong and competitive roster. What were your feelings and expectations heading into the year?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I don't really think I had many preconceived. I was expecting to be a sub going into it. That was kind of where my head's at, because obviously I'm the only new player coming into a roster. The roster just had such success in Overwatch League Season 1, so I wasn't really expecting to like randomly get all this playtime. And that's kind of where I started the season. Like my goal as a player, a good example is in Season 1 Overwatch League, I had some mid-season offers, or at least teams who wanted to talk to me mid-season. But I'd pretty much made up my mind that like my goal is to improve as a player, and I don't think the best place to do that is in Overwatch League. Overwatch League is such a grind where like every week you have a match, sometimes you have 2 matches in a week. You can never be focused on what to fix. You're always just focused on like the best performance this week every week. And I think that Contenders not only allows like a more lax schedule when it comes to performing, but it also just sets you up better to be trying to fix and improve the issues you have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great point, and it's something that I actually brought up with a lot of, or a couple of the player guests that I had on. Something I brought up with Dogman, a theory I have in terms of guys who potentially make the league too early. Like everyone does everything they can to make the Overwatch League. Another example is Kodak with the Atlanta Reign, who made the Overwatch League and now moved back into Contenders as well. And it's terrific when you have that option, but for a lot of guys, I think they just tunnel vision on making Overwatch League rather than being the best player they can be and focusing on, okay, I'm definitely going to come in the correct situation here. I'm going to be able to get playing time. I'm not going to end up on the bench, because that's, I think, how a lot of careers can end prematurely, is if you make it and you're not good enough, you're going to a roster that is all too competitive, and then you just don't have any opportunity to play. And obviously, you signing a two-way, you have a way back into one of the best places to develop, which is Fusion University, right? So do you think there's something to that theory, that maybe players shouldn't, if they can obviously afford it, look to just make Overwatch League before they're ready? Is there something as being in there too
Well,
early?
so I think it depends how long you want your career to be, really. If you're looking to be in Overwatch League for 1 to 2 years and then go to college, I think that trying to make Overwatch League as quickly as possible is very reasonable. Or if you're someone who's in like their 20s and you can't really support yourself or get where you want to be in your career being in Contenders, I think that's another very valid reason to try to really push for Overwatch League. But at the time I was 18, now I'm 19. I'll be 20 going into season 3 of Overwatch League. And I am saving most of my money so that if this career doesn't work out, I can go to college and I can pay for myself and support myself in that way. But the way I've always viewed the two-way contracts are it stops you from being put in a spot where you're not playing on the main team, and that means you get less scrim time, and the less scrim time you get, the worse you get. And it kind of just goes into this cycle of, well, for the entire season, you're probably not going to see playtime.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so a lot of people look at it two ways. It's like, oh, the org's not competent that this player could be a starter, or the org doesn't think this player is really good. Whereas I think from the player point of view, it's like kind of a safety net where it lets you take that step. Like I would feel terrible if I argued my way to a one way and then didn't get any play time and then felt terrible as my career ended after the season, because the turnover rate for subs, at least in season 1 of Overwatch League, was so high.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you didn't get play time, you don't get scrim time, people can't really see you perform, and it kind of decreases your value as a player. So I think moving forward, more players should push for two ways, especially if they have academy teams that are doing well. I think it's only an upside. I personally at least don't see a downside to being on a two-way. Worst case, you're playing in contenders,
Mm-hmm.
and the other worst case, if you're on a one-way, is you're not playing at all. And I know a lot of teams really struggle to balance scrim time, again, because it's much more focused on the immediate performance rather than improving over time. And in the immediate performance standpoint, giving sub scrim time can be like detrimental to your team's performance. So I definitely think two ways are extremely beneficial for
Mm-hmm.
players.
Yeah, I mean, speaking from a coach's perspective, I completely echo that statement because as a coach, you're also put in these precarious spots where you want to give your subs playtime. You don't want them to just kind of rot on the bench, for lack of a better term, to the point where even if they would come back, they would be just so rusty that they can't even contribute, or they can't contribute to the best of their potential. But at the same time, the schedule is hectic. You eventually have to commit to a 6-man roster, and that's unless there are hero pool limitations to some of your players, and you have a rotation based on that. But as far as the main roles goes, which is the front line and the back line, like that's where you pretty much have to have a solid player in there consistently. But you also need subs to actually have a little bit of depth so that you can adapt if something changes, especially if some of your players aren't as flexible. So definitely a dilemma for the coaches as well. But do you think every Overwatch League team should have an academy team, so that this is an option that is readily available? Because we've seen other teams starting to utilize their talent like this now.
In an ideal world, I do think every OWL team should have an academy team. Not only because it supports T2 in the path to pro, but also because I think it makes it more attractive to go to as a player. I don't like I think it's much scarier to join a team that has no academy team. And I also think it's less clear, like assuming in, let's say, 6 years, Overwatch League has grown, they have more teams, and you're a player going into contenders and you want to join New York Excelsior. And let's say New York are now a mixed roster, so there's a potential to that if you're a New York resident. It would be cool if one of the ways you can actually join their team is by playing on their contenders team and letting them kind of turn you into the player they're going to want, and then bringing you up. And I think that that's one of the things Fusion has done really well with their academy team, is like everyone on the contenders team in every iteration has had the potential to be an OWL starting player. And I've said it in other interviews, but the point of the contenders team is to make people who are ready for Overwatch League. It's not necessarily to be winning all the time, even though that was a byproduct, especially in NA, of us practicing to be Overwatch League players. So I think that if that's kind of the mentality of academy teams, is that you're trying to shape your future talent, it would definitely be beneficial for any teams trying to use it that way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Like a good example is what happened with the Mayhem
Yeah,
Academy
I was
roster,
about to
right?
say, yeah.
Like a lot of players from that have gone into Overwatch League and been very successful. And even though they didn't win contenders, and even though they may not have necessarily looked like the flashiest players, they're definitely like handling themselves well in the OWL environment. And I think that was like another good example of how an academy team succeeded.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I was about to say about that example, because the way the academy coaches handled I think not the season right before Al, but the one before that, where everyone was just playing goats in contenders, and they weren't for the first 2 weeks. They were playing a bunch of poke compositions, the Farah Ash, things like that. And they were developing other compositions and trying to counter it and learning different ways to play the game, just developing a solid base of fundamentals. And obviously, because of that, they just couldn't catch up in goats, and then they only barely stayed in contenders actually, and they just couldn't catch up. But at the same time, heading into the season after that, they had a pretty solid base of fundamentals, even though it was mostly goats. That's where it sort of paid off, and now you see, like you say, a lot of them coming in and being immediate contributors on a team that was a semifinalist in the stage playoffs. So definitely. definitely something people should consider. But it's also tough, I think for academy coaches especially, because academy coaches in their own right want to, how are they going to move up? Obviously internally they can move up by just showing what they're capable of. If you can, if the staff is there consistently and they see how you develop the players, that's one way. But usually if you want to go to another team, that's probably going to be results, right?
Yeah, so it's really interesting coaching wise for Fusion Uni because so far the past two coaches for Fusion Uni have gone on to be head coaches of OWL
Yeah,
teams, which is a crazy trajectory.
yeah.
But I do think that it must be very hard to coach an academy team. And it must be even worse if you're either an assistant coach or like another analyst or support staff on an academy team because it almost feels like your ability to move up is much more on people's impression of you publicly than it is on your actual performance in that role.
Mhm.
Which I could see being extremely stressful if you're trying to move up because it almost then at that point feels like it's your team results and the public image of you that matter, and your actual work, other than like word of mouth, won't really impact it that much. Um, yeah, that's a really weird position to be in. I don't know how people manage
Yeah.
that, to be honest.
Yeah, it's crazy because yeah, you have very conflicted. Are you gonna focus on your career, or are you gonna focus on what's the best for the players? Because in reality, what academy is to me, it's like coaching a college team in basketball. You're not looking to move up. A lot of those college coaches have like 10, 15-year contracts, and they're only there. They know it's going to be a revolving door. Guys are going to be coming in and out every year, and they're just there to develop talent. They have job security and so on. But obviously, contenders being such a financial risk. I mean, you kind of have to make your money back somewhere. Even if you win, there's really not enough money. So really, where the value comes from is actually developing talent, is actually moving up the talent to your team, and that leading to good performances in the Overwatch League, or creating assets, so to speak, to make moves like Mayhem managed to do, swinging players like Toronto did, moving up their players. Obviously, like presumably Philadelphia is going to do with their team heading into next year as well. You guys have a ton of terrific players over there as well, especially Alarm, who I think is going to step in and probably be a top 5 flex support. So it is an extremely difficult situation, and I think just because it's not as financially viable, and because everyone wants to make the Overwatch League, especially from a coaching perspective, it just probably creates a weird kind of environment. And like you say, the Philadelphia Fusion coaches, they won everything, and both of them are head coaches, so really winning does influence where you go, right? Same thing with the Mayhem coaches, almost like they
Yes.
had a really successful season, and now most of them are in Owl, right? So
Yeah.
pretty crazy. Um, so what did you feel like were the biggest differences between OWL and Contenders when you stepped in and you were in that OWL environment?
Um. It sounds weird to say, but I don't think there are many. I think that other than the more rigid schedule, there really aren't any at all, actually. The quality of teams and the quality of scrim practice is pretty much the same in terms of like teams don't randomly throw. Every team is competent. Obviously, you have some players who are like amazing in Overwatch League. Like there were some times playing with Carpe where Carpe picks McCree and you're like, is this really the right swap here? And then he kills 4 people and you're like, okay, sure. That's wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that the main difference really just comes down to the schedule and the duration. Like in Contenders, there were some seasons in NA where it's like you play 5 weeks, take a week break, play playoffs, then it's over. Then you get like a 2 month break. And it doesn't matter how healthy your lifestyle is. It doesn't matter how much you're sleeping, really, because you can kind of just power through and get through it 100% of the time. Whereas you get to Overwatch League and you're like, okay, I'm committing to doing this every day for like 7 months. And if my lifestyle is not great and I'm not sleeping enough, like those things will build up and eventually become a big problem. So for me, for instance, in Contenders, I would consume copious amounts of caffeine for every match. I wouldn't sleep enough. I'd consume way too much caffeine. I would get super hyped for matches and I'd crash afterwards. But in Overwatch League, that just wasn't an option because I couldn't do that. I couldn't do that every day. I couldn't do that every match. So what I did when I was a sub and I wasn't getting playtime was I was like, okay, I'm going to quit caffeine. I'm going to go to the gym every day. I'm going to try to fix my diet, fix my sleep. But that I think was the biggest difference for me. It's just the duration you have to be prepared for is so much longer. It's crazy.
Yeah, it's great actually to hear that when you aren't getting playing time, that you're using that time proactively, because it's something that I've stressed to a lot of players who aren't getting playing time, who I've had to work with, is that just take this time to really take care of your health, like put yourself in a better spot mentally. Like, even if it's not gonna immediately put you on stage, it's gonna put you in a better mind state. It's gonna help you further down your career. It's gonna give you a little bit of longevity. So definitely something that a lot of subs should be doing, but I think a lot of them aren't. I think a lot of people adapt the mentality of, oh, let me just grind harder so that I can get back on stage, and they just grind ranked mindlessly, and they don't fix their health. But yeah, I think the scheduling is definitely the biggest difference. I mean, I helped out and coached the Mayhem Academy guys last summer, and like getting through that season, it was like 5 weeks essentially, and I was like, wow, this was kind of easy. I
Yeah,
did,
it's very short.
yeah, like I did 3 stages of season one, and I was like, holy shit, like the contenders one was so much easier because you can reset, and there's more seasons, and it feels like there's, yeah, like it's just short. It like nothing really adds up as much, I don't think, when you
Yeah.
don't have 2 games every week, pretty much. So something that I was interested about as well, because obviously you were planning to come in as a sub, as you mentioned, but you also made your debut in stage one, subbing in for Boombox. And the way the so to lay the table a little bit about how that happened, to those
Yeah,
to
okay,
those
so it's
yeah.
we'll try to think about it. It's 2 days before our first match, and Boombox is so incredibly sick he couldn't get out of bed. Like he had a really bad fever. Like walking around was very hard for him.
Mhm.
So we decided to scrim that day, and we're saying, okay, Elk, you can sub on flex support. You're not playing the matches, but we just need scrim time right now. We're gonna hope Boom's better. And we scrim. I actually do reasonably okay. Like it was okay at that time. And we get to day two, one day before our match against I think Mayhem, and Boom still can't do anything. So we're like, okay, Elk might have to play the match tomorrow. I'm like, okay, understandable. I we practice, we do more scrims, they go okay. We get to the match, we play the match. Obviously, we lose to Mayhem. That wasn't the ideal setup for that. And then going forward, I'm of the mindset where it's like, okay, Boom's going to be healthy. I'm not going to be playing flex support. Great. Boom still ends up being sick for the Dallas game. So then I end up playing the Dallas game where I actually wasn't super unhappy with how I performed in the Dallas game on flex support. I was more unhappy with how I played in the Mayhem match, but I just think that was because the amount of time I had to like actually prepare as a flex support was almost non-existent. Um, and then come the Dallas game, again we lost, but it felt more competitive at least. But it really was just super unfortunate. And I think it does show the value of having subs in that role. Like if we had someone who was playing flex support every day and had played flex support in a scrim environment who could have stepped in for Boom, I think the team would have done a lot better as a whole. But it was really unlucky timing, to be honest, for Boombox to get sick right before the games.
Hmm.
Um,
And it's not the optimal circumstances to make your debut as well, right? Like off rolling on very short notice.
yeah, especially because we knew going into that I could only play 2 matches that stage.
Hmm.
And there were plans for me to play at least some maps on main support that stage
Hmm.
to try to help me get like more familiar with the stage and also integrate with the team more. But once he got sick, it wasn't really possible to do that for like understandable reasons. And I'm not annoyed about it or have any resentment about it. It was kind of just like an unfortunate circumstance.
Hmm.
But now I can say it's very funny. I can now say the only highlight of me in Overwatch League is me playing Tracer, which is I also think I have the highest KD on Tracer in
Nice.
Overwatch League, despite only playing it for 2 minutes. But I do think
Nice.
that's at least a fun stat I got out of it.
Yeah, I mean, Snello was dominating all the stats in Overwatch League as far as Tracer goes after one stage. Like
Yeah.
he didn't get playtime after that, but he was still dominating in all the stats categories. Now you've taken that mantle for him, and now you guys are on the same team. So that's pretty funny. So you were actually aware of the 2 game rule.
Oh yeah, for that stage I was
Hmm.
going into it, and it made sense. I think it was like obviously as a player a little unfortunate, but
Hmm.
Like we knew about it going in, so it wasn't like a surprise or anything.
Okay, yeah, because I was wondering whether it was a surprise because, well, to kind of explain to the listeners what the two-game rule was, it was basically put in place right before the Overwatch League Stage 1, and it was basically if two-way players were signed before the season and they played in the contender season right before Overwatch League, they were limited to just two appearances in Stage 1. And the way I've had it explained to me why that rule was in place is basically so that you just can't move your OWL roster to contenders, boost your contenders roster, and just get some free money, and then move them right back into Overwatch League, right? So that was kind of why they did it. On the flip side, it also puts a lot of players who are right on the cusp of potentially developing into an Overwatch League player in a very precarious spot, because what if they perform extremely well in that season and they're ready to start in Stage 1? Well, you can't. So then you're stuck in limbo, right? And that's kind of the thing that they probably didn't consider. And the guys that were affected by this were obviously Apply, who we moved up to a regular contract, and then also Fusions with Boston, who they also moved up to a regular contract. But I think they were probably caught off guard by that, as far as I know.
Yeah, I wasn't really. I as soon as I signed the 2A, I actually checked in with player ops just to
Mhm.
confirm everything about how it worked. And Killinger was super helpful in figuring all that out. But I think the way I view it is it's trying to give more stability to who's actually playing. Because it would be a little weird if you are a two-way player and you win a contender season and then the team commits to bring you up in stage 1 and you play in stage 1 and they immediately put you back on the contenders team after stage 1 ends. You don't play stage 2 and then they're like, okay, we'll bring you up again for stage 3. And it pretty much adds like a stage delay where you have to
Mhm.
commit to saying, okay, we're going to bring this player up into the owl team. We're going to commit the time for them being an owl player. Then they're going to play the stage and continuing. Because I, I do totally understand the worry of having players kind of bounce back and forth and wanting it to be more of a commitment thing. Um, but yeah, it is unfortunate. I do think some teams weren't as clear about it, I guess.
Mhm.
But
Yeah.
at least I definitely was aware of it going
Okay.
in.
Okay. That's good then. Because yeah, I mean it's probably put in place so that yeah, there's a stage delay. You have more stability. You can still use the guys as subs unless they're in Korea. Obviously, you can't really fly over now.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I mean, it sort of makes sense. It just kind of sucks for like that time period. I think the only time it doesn't really make sense, or when it affects players negatively, or potentially prevents players from playing, is right before the season, like that little window there. Okay, so and also another thing to consider with that is that if you are in that boat, then you kind of either have to move up the player, or you in stage 1, or you're not really going to be able to get playtime. So presumably after that, when you have to step in, because like you said, plan was let's get Elk in and get him some playtime on his main role for certain games, probably craft out which games he's going to play. We definitely were thinking like that with Apply, but obviously when you kind of burn your two games very early in the stage, well, then it's presumably hard to get scrim time afterwards, right? Because you're just ineligible for the rest of the stage.
Yeah. So I don't want to get too much into the details about when I was going to have playtime, but there were a few chances before stage 1, during stage 1, before stage 2, during stage 2, where I had like real shots at getting playtime. But again, it's like it's very hard to, I think, integrate a player so quickly into a roster
Yeah.
that not only has been together for a year but had such success together. So, like, I don't have any resentment towards like any of the fusion coaches or any of the players, just because like they work really well together as a team. They all like comm wise have roles that I would say are uncommon in other teams in the way they function. So like trying to step into that and just expect to be a starter, I think would be silly. Um, but it's definitely I agree it made it harder than it would have been otherwise. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and something you mentioned, at several points when people were going, especially with Philly, kind of struggling a little bit, or struggling to reach at least reach the same heights they did last year, is that, oh, they should try something else. They should put in this or that guy. And, obviously with you being on the roster, especially during stage 2, that was a common thing a lot of people said. They're like, oh, let's put Elkin. And something you did was that you publicly came out and said, well, no. Fusion is just better with Neptuno. Like, stop with this narrative. And he actually did the same thing with Moth as it pertains to Team USA. And to me, it showed a lot of humility, because you are coming in. Obviously, you're still a very young player, but you're coming into the league being very hyped, being a 3-time contenders champion. And to say that is, it shows a lot of humility, and it takes a lot of heat off of the coaching staff. But is that something, why do you think Neptuno worked better? Is it just because of that synergy that you build over an entire season, playing over 40 games on stage together? It's very difficult to kind of intercept that and, make up that synergy on the fly over a short period of time.
So it's interesting. When I'm thinking about other players, I don't think I ever compare myself to other people. Generally, the way I do it is if I have something I want to improve at, I look at players who I think do it well. But very rarely do I try to draw a comparison between myself and somebody else, because I think that that's it's too easy, since obviously I'd be biased about how I play, to compare yourself to other people. So what I did is I just ask other people. Like, I ask, like, what do you think of this? What do you think of this? How do you think this player performs? And for the Neptuno thing, like, just from specking scrims, it was very clear to me that the team played better when he was in. Him and I both calm very differently and want different amounts of like control in what we say and how plans are executed. And other people on the Fusion roster, like Eco, are like super focused on the macro game. And it just doesn't make sense to have two people who are both trying to do that in at the same time. So it was like a lot of both how Neptuno calmed, and from my personal opinion at least, I thought mechanically he was definitely better than me at Mercy. I think Lucio was a bit closer, but as far as Mercy, I think he's one of the best Mercies in the league. And then from the Moth standpoint, I think it was when I got asked to try out for Team USA, I was like, this is silly. Like, how are you guys not just gonna pick Moth and go with it? Like, you're really gonna run trials when he's won a stage, he's been arguably one of the best main supports in the league this season. Like, it's just not it's almost not worth my time to try to compete with him, because one, I think so highly of him that I'm gonna be rooting for him to get on the team, even if I'm trialing. And two, it's just strange that other people wouldn't just go that way. Like, I have no hesitation to say someone's better than me. I like to think everybody's better than me. When I'm ever prepping for another team, I always like to think that they're gonna like bring their A game. They're gonna strat us and try to counter strat us and beat us, and they're gonna like be on their best today. So the only time I haven't done that in like the past year was versus Goats, actually. 2 times. Our 2 losses to Goats were because our entire team took them as a meme.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't put any thought into the comp. We thought they were a trash team that wasn't going to do anything, and we got destroyed both times. And it was right after we won Season 1 Contenders, so we were on like this high. And after that, I was like, okay, this is just a bad way to be taking the game. Like, I should just be treating every match and every other player like they're amazing and trying to beat them as if they're like the best player they can be. And I think that served me a lot better, both in like my own improvement and also prepping for other teams.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that definitely makes sense. So just to finish up like the fusion part of this before we move into fusion uni. Obviously, Philly hasn't reached the same heights as they did last year. What do you think the main reasons for that has been? Do you think it's just not being able to quite adapt to the Goats meta, that not being the strength of this roster?
I actually think if you look at their regular season performance from last year and their regular season performance this year, they're pretty
Similar.
similar.
Yeah.
And I think that the strength of Fusion is like in the clutch situations, they tend to just magically become an amazing, like they go from being a good team to being an amazing team when it's like the last match, everything's on the line. So I have a lot of faith for them going into playoffs. But I I do think that people might just be expecting too much consistency. Like, I think the teams that have been really like even Shock have 5 losses. The teams that have been really consistent are like New York, but they keep losing in playoffs, and Titans, who are just I feel like Titans were an irregularity in Overwatch League. Um, I feel like for the most part in the regular season, teams are going to have ups and downs. Like Boston is a great example. They had a lot of ups and downs in season 1, but they're like peaks were really really high.
Mm-hmm.
And Fusion is a team I think are generally at least hit their peak at the end of the season. I'm not sure why, to be honest, but it does seem like where they hit their peak.
Mm-hmm.
So I have high hopes for them going into season playoffs.
Mm-hmm. So for yourself, obviously you end up going to Korea for Contenders now. I'm curious about how that decision was made. When was that put on the table for you to potentially go back and kind of regroup with your old teammates or some of your old teammates? When was that put on the table? Was it a no-brainer? Walk me through that process.
Yeah, so it was my choice. I pushed for it. And it started with a conversation in the early parts of stage 2 where I said I don't think I can recover as a player if I'm on the bench for the rest of the season. And I talked to the coaching staff about it, and I talked to Kirby, who's the manager of Fusion, and I was like, I need some other solution, and it can either be trying to give me more scrim time in the Owl team, or it can be trying to move me back to the Contenders team. But it was pretty clear to me that like one of those two things needed to happen for me. And then Kirby brought up to me that there was a high likelihood that they tried to move the Contenders team to Korea. And I would feel really bad since Karkar had performed so well on the Contenders team if I just like swooped in and took the spot and displaced him. Like that to me wasn't really going to be an option. I wasn't like just morally okay with doing that. Like that would feel like shit. So when I heard the team was moving to Korea and that would have been a lot harder for Karkar to transition, I was like, okay, this is actually a possibility that I can go do. And then from there, as soon as I was sure I wasn't going to be getting scrim time that I felt okay with or an amount that I was happy with, I kind of started going through that process where it was decided after the stage 2 break, I'd go to uni or I'd go with uni to Korea and play in that season of Contenders.
hmm And how has that transition been? Like living in Korea, is it the first time you are in Korea? And how has that transition been? Because obviously I was in Korea as well for a boot camp for 2 months, and it is quite an adjustment for a Western person going there for a little bit of a while.
Yeah, I think the thing I miss the most is Amazon. Believe it or not, like
Yeah.
just having 2-day delivery on anything I want was really nice. Um, I don't think it's been that severe. I lived in Thailand for like 3
Mm.
months. I lived in Taiwan for about a month and a half, 2 months. Taiwan, I was playing LAN the entire time at the Oceanic Pacific Championship for Overwatch, despite losing pretty badly in that event.
Mhm.
I think that so much of it stays the same that it's not really that big of a transition. Like you're still playing Overwatch 6 to 8 hours a day. You're still, living with your teammates, which is pretty much the same. So I wouldn't say it's been that hard of a transition, but it's new and fun. So
hmm And how long are you gonna stay in Korea? Is it just for the season, then you're going back to the US, or what's the plan in regards to that?
yeah, so I'll be going back to the US like early September. Hopefully we qualify for Gauntlet. If we do, that'll be I think December or around there. But yeah, I think right now I'm only in Korea until the end of this season, and then I'll be going back. And it'll be interesting because I'm not sure exactly the timetable on Overwatch League contracts,
hmm
but depending on when they expire, my contract might like I don't know the dates on that, so that will also determine it.
Gotcha. So from a competition perspective, how has being in what's sort of actually before we get to the competition, what have the biggest differences been between NA and Korean Contenders? Because obviously you mentioned a little bit of a nugget that you can bring up again of how it differs from infrastructural point of view. Obviously, it's not on land anymore, which is a little bit unfortunate, but there are differences. So. Are there any more differences than what you mentioned? And can you walk us through how that whole process is with admins coming into your home?
Yeah, so one of the biggest differences for actual game days is about 25 minutes before the match is scheduled to start. An admin shows up, you let them in, they check all your computers, they check all the webcams. And then as the match is starting, like they take your phones, they make sure your coaches and subs aren't in the room with you. They make sure nothing else is open on your computer other than Line, which they use for the webcam recording, Discord, which we have registered as our voice chat program, and Overwatch. And then the other interesting differences are just, I think, team quality. Like every team in Korean Contenders is so much closer in terms of not only how they play, but just like the highs and lows they have. Like in NA Contenders, it was very uncommon for a team to be as clutch as we were, I think. Like that's why our map 5 record was so strong, is because we were the team that would just always bring more energy on map 5s. And I think that in Korean Contenders, a lot more teams have that experience. And a lot more players are more veteran and just have more LAN experience and competing experience in general. So I personally like it because it gives you more of a challenge to live up to. Like it was getting almost stressful to play the third season of North American Contenders because it's like we are just expected to go undefeated and win.
Yeah.
And like when that expectation's put on you, anything that's not undefeated and winning looks like failure.
Hmm.
And it's like that's just such an unreasonable expectation to have of a team, especially when the focus of our team shouldn't be to be winning. The focus of our team should be to be improving. And obviously winning is always better. And obviously everybody wants to be winning, but the real end goal for every player should be improving and getting to Overwatch League. So I like it because it's more of a challenge and you get to improve more, and also just because it's different and it's new and the expectations on us are very different. Those are all just
Hmm.
cool aspects of it.
Do you think? What do you feel about the competition aspect in terms of the talent that is there? Because a lot of people like to jump on this narrative that, oh well, Korea is now start of all the talent, all the good coaches are gone, the good players are gone, and it's over for Korea. They're no longer the strongest region. That's why we had all of these talks about NA or EU would smash Runaway. All that stuff. Do you think that's been a little overblown? How do you feel the talent level there is there over in Korea?
So I think there's a couple aspects. I think the mindset is important for the player improvement here, and I think that the real way that a talent drain would happen, in my opinion, is if all of the good players leave too quickly. Because then you don't like the main reason I think the Korean teams are so good is because they have really good teams like Runaway and like O2 Blast and like Genji who you can scrim against and you can prep against and you like get that real scrim experience playing versus. And you also get to play matches versus them. And let's say next season of Overwatch League, O2 Blast and Genji and Runaway are all gone. They all go to Overwatch League. That's okay because all the teams that were right below them who are practicing against them are also improving. And they can kind of take that spot as those new veteran players and contenders. So unless everybody from Korean contenders disappears at like the same time, which I think is pretty unlikely, I think you'll, for a while at least, have this environment of just like hyper focused on improvement teams that just produce good talent.
Hmm.
Um, I do think that on average in Korean contenders, the teams are way better than North America or Europe. But the other thing to understand is it's just kind of the way the environment works. Like I don't think there was an interesting tweet by a league player by saying it's harder for NA solo queue players to reach the LCS because NA solo queue is just worse than EU and Korean solo queue, and you just play worse players. And I wouldn't say that about the solo queue aspect, but at least about the scrimming aspect, it must be so much harder to practice and become a good team playing against the trials teams in NA that made it to contenders, because like 7 trials teams or something made it in,
Yeah.
than it is to play against like O2 Blast or Runaway or Genji. Like those teams are so much more disciplined and also just so much more practiced about Overwatch in general.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, if you look at it, there's obviously fewer teams, which means the talent is gonna be more concentrated. There's gonna be more strong teams because it's not as diluted. I think that's definitely one point of it. And then, like you say, even if players leave, like you can trust a team like Runaway to rebuild their roster just like they did, just reload and bring in new talents and have that infrastructure to really. Uh, Create a serious environment where everyone improves, and they've proven that they can do that over and over and over again. And I think that's certainly something that's true in Korea because I think almost, I'm not sure whether you know this, but I'm pretty sure like most teams, especially at least in contenders, they have gaming houses, right?
I think all do.
Hmm. Exactly, and
Because
it's
I'm
yeah,
I'm pretty sure if you don't, I don't know how the admin would check
exactly,
on you.
yeah, yeah,
Like
that's
it might almost
interesting.
be a requirement,
Yeah,
actually.
yeah. So
But
that's pretty interesting. Do you think and that's like just by being having everyone in the house and having to have an admin come to you, and that being a requirement, that almost forces you to be more structured, right? Just by
yeah,
that
and
being
it
in place.
forces more professionalism. I think it's overall good for getting used to playing as a team and getting used to playing in such like a serious environment.
Do you think that's too hard to execute in another region just because of the size of the region, like US obviously being that big? There's been a lot of 15, 16-year-olds in contenders.
Yeah, I do think it's something that would only be possible in Korea, which is kind of unfortunate. But I don't really see an easy solution for that. I do think that a good step to getting every region to improve is stuff like the gauntlet and stuff like the showdowns. Like more international competition will definitely help bridge that gap, I feel. Um, but yeah, it does kind of seem weird that just for like the size of the country can matter so much about what infrastructure you can set up for contenders.
Mhm. And I mean, yeah, it's very interesting because of exactly how close this season is. So obviously, like you guys are 1-2, but if you look at the table, so far 3 weeks in, we've had only one match that's been 4-0 out of all the matches, right? Which is
Yeah.
pretty insane. 12 games, 1-4-0. Map differential between first and sixth is just 6 maps. Between I think third and sixth is like 2 maps, right? So it's very, very close. You see teams like Genji and O2 who are both 3-0, but Genji barely beat Meta who are 0-3 in fifth place. You have O2 who are had a close, very close win against you guys. So it seems like the parity is actually insane this season, and you wouldn't be surprised by anyone taking it almost, right?
Yeah, I think that one of the coolest things is that really every team is so close. Like the reason some teams are winning is individual clutch plays, which is kind of cool. Like even in a meta where there's like so much 3-3 and so much team play required, like a lot of the things that win these matches because they always go the distance and they're so close are like the hero flank shatter or like the like transcendence to counter the EMP or like a May pick that ends up working out really well on map 5 or something like that. So I'm not sure why every team is so close, but I very much like it as far as like a competition standpoint. I think it's a lot more fun not only to watch but also to play in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, it pushes you as a player, like you said, perhaps not having a challenge over in NA and having that expectation upon you. It creates, like you say, a bit of an ego where you were like, you just disregarded goats and you learned that that is not a good mindset through losing. And so heading into Korea, where any mistake can be punished and any game can be won or lost, and you can't just rely on flipping the switch in map 5, like that puts you a little bit on your toes, right? And like teaches you more than you probably would in North America.
Yeah, I think as from a individual development standpoint, it is much better to be in Korean contenders than North American contenders. I think that winning North American contenders might look flashy, and that might be the way to get into Overwatch League as quickly as possible. But as far as actually being the best player you can be, it's much better to be in the fire and not only having wins but also having losses. Like one of my concerns is I hadn't lost when I went to Overwatch League in like 8 months, which is an absurd amount of time not to have a loss. And it sucks. Losing sucks. You have to get used to losing. Overwatch League is long. You're gonna lose. You have to be able to bounce back up the next day and say like, okay, I lost yesterday. Today I'm still gonna play my best and I'm gonna be consistent. And it was that was very hard for me because I just hadn't been in that situation. So I would much prefer having a more like rocky road and getting used to the ups and downs of both the team environment and team performance rather than just kind of like coasting for for almost a year in one region.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, being on the other side of the spectrum and being a perennial loser and having lost as much as I have, I can definitely attest to the fact that you learn just so much more from losing. Obviously, there has to be a healthy balance, right? Like you don't want to just lose all the time as we did with Mayhem, but you learn so much about yourself and how you tackle issues. During last year, that's probably the most I've grown as a person and as a coach. Going through all of that adversity, like it's nothing can ever teach you how to handle all of that stuff except for actually being there, being like feeling that pain, right? So it's it's definitely better for your development to have a bit of balance. So let's start with your first match, because your match against Runaway was, I'd say it's fair to say, probably the most hyped up regular season match in
Yeah,
Contenders
even though we're
history.
both 1-2 now.
Yeah, but
But yeah.
heading like the narrative heading into that game was that this is the titans um of the contender scene clashing. What was the expectation heading into that game? Like, what were you thinking? Was there any pressure considering how much of a high profile game it was?
Um I wouldn't really say so. I mean, I told my team I'd pay for KBBQ for every person if we won going into it. That got everybody pretty excited. But I think that the way we went into that game was we're gonna play what we've been practicing. We're not gonna be deviating. We're not gonna be like getting scared in the match or anything. We're gonna be like executing our plan. And I think that it was kind of I wouldn't say wake up call, but it was just a good push in the direction that like every other team is also trying at 200% to win their matches. And I don't teams may have been trying like that in North America, but their results were very different against us. So playing against Runaway, when we saw how close it was, we were like, okay, we're good enough to be competing. We're definitely able to beat all these teams. We just have to like be putting in the extra work right now to make sure we're getting over that hump. And it was a little sad in our match against O2 because we definitely should have won map 4. Even against Runaway, we definitely should have won Volskaya, and those both should have been 3-1 matches for us. But like tiny mistakes in both those matches are what cost us it. So it's a little disheartening to look back at, but it's also one of those things where like you can look at the bright side, which is like you can be competing. You are definitely good enough. You just need to get over those little mistakes and you will be beating these teams.
Mm-hmm.
So I wouldn't say we were nervous going into it, but we were definitely respecting them considering their reputation.
Mm-hmm. So that's interesting that you talk about those two maps specifically, because I quickly ran through those games just to give myself a bit of a reminder, as to how you lost. And those are the two maps that I kind of pegged as the difference makers. Obviously, Volskaya being a map where, like you said, it really comes down to a lot of individual plays. So you guys put yourselves in a spot where you needed one more fight to hold second on Volskaya. You had, I think, I don't remember exactly, but I think it was Grav, Beat, and something else. And they only had they had Beat and Shatter. You got their Beat out. You were kiting, and then they sneak in a manual hack on your Reinhardt. You get shattered. You don't get to use your Grav. So like you can't ask for a better setup for that fight for you guys to close out the map, but
Yeah,
it comes
but
down to that play, right?
right, and it also comes down to like us realizing in comms, okay, in these stall fights, we need to be tracking Sombra better.
Yeah.
And then, for instance, going into our third match against O2 Blast, we were way better about shutting down Shatter plays because we felt like in the Runaway match, Shatter's got a disproportionate amount of value versus us. So in the O2 match, we're way better about shutting down Shatter plays. But then there were other things that got us. Like we failed to adapt the first time to the Hanzo Goats. We played Sombra Goats into it for a whole defense, and we got massively snowballed because we had never played against this comp. And we just weren't sure what to go.
Mm-hmm.
And then on the second round, we got it right. We went Diva, and it worked out better. But in the first fight, Alarm got picked because they went Sombra, and he got picked in like the most annoying way, which is like a fire strike as
Yeah.
the Sombra
Yeah.
decloaks. So there's not even time to save him from our brig, and it's like looking back on it, it's like super unfortunate. You're like, oh, we were so close to winning, but it's important just to take the lesson that like we need to be better at adapting when they go Hanzo Goats. We need to know what we want to play. We need to be positioning better so that those kind of plays can't happen where they kill Alarm. Like if I was low ground instead of high ground, maybe I can boop the Sombra and that buys enough time. And so it's like just trying to focus on what you can improve from those maps rather than the like tiny individual things that went wrong to end up losing the map.
Mm-hmm. So that was a comp that actually surprised you, right? The Hansa Goats, because I noted that down and I was going to ask you because it feel like they had a very clear plan. If they saw you playing Sombra Goats with an Ana, they knew you don't have a counter for their, like Grav and Dragon is a free one fight at that point. They can just snipe the Gravs and they can snipe the Hans Ultimates, which is how they turned you in fights when they lost Reinhardt at certain points, right? Was that the first time you guys ran into that comp?
Surprisingly enough, we'd actually played it in scrims a couple times, but not for that reason. And I think that the main adaptation we had to make is we wanted to play Zen against the Hanzo, so we had Trance.
Yep.
But we also needed to play Diva, and I think the Diva swap was a bit harder for us to figure out if it was worth just swapping the Sombra. Because there's also some concern if you play just 3-3 on defense that Sombra Goats can run you over. So I think that in the match we decided that like we're just gonna go Diva Zen and hope that that is enough to beat the Sombra Goats, and then obviously the Hanzo Goats, and then they went Sombra, and it didn't obviously turn out ideally, but yeah, it did catch us a bit off guard, and I don't think we had the best and quickest reaction to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that was interesting because I actually noticed that as well. I'm like, I saw you guys adapting, like making that adaptation for the second round. And I was like, oh, they actually thought about this, and then they made the counter adjustment. And yeah, like you say, it was it felt a little bit lucky them sneaking in that fire strike, especially when you guys are on goats. Like that fire strike, you would think it most of the time that won't
Yeah, it
go
was
through,
definitely
right?
unlucky that it got
Yeah,
through.
exactly. So the adjustment was fine. I thought, especially since there wasn't that much time on the clock, you kind of like your chances with the goats there, as long as you don't get run over in the first neutral, right, like that. Um,
Yeah, the downside is losing the first neutral against Sombra Goats is so snowbally for the
yeah.
attacking team that it's pretty
Mhm.
hard to come back from that.
Yeah, and even then, like with your adjustments, it felt like you guys had a terrific chance to win that fight. You were one fight away. I think you guys blew a little too many ultimates in the choke point, but still, you were in a position where they didn't have a proper 6v6. They had to use ults just to touch the point, and then there were just so many unfortunate events. Snillo goes for a
Yeah,
flail and he
the
gets boofed. Yeah,
boops were really
yeah,
unfortunate. Yeah,
yeah. So, and that's
but
again really that's what it comes down to. That play on Volskaya when you guys can't create a better situation for yourselves, the play on Rialto. Um, and then you go into Nepal 99 100. They bring out the Hanzo again, I think, on Nepal, I believe, on
yeah,
Village, right?
they did versus
Um,
our May Goats. They played Hanzo.
yeah, which was also like you can see kind of their thought processes, because if they can force the fight on the point, a lot of nice angles for the dragon. They use the dragon very, very well, and especially when you guys
Yeah,
don't have the diva,
the
they farm that ultimate so fast. They farm it faster than
yeah,
the
and
MP.
they break shield so quick. The
Yeah,
dragon is so impactful in the
yeah,
tiny space.
yeah. It
Really all
was
around, it's
yeah.
very strong.
Yeah, it was a very, very interesting composition. But then like on the maps where you guys are prepared and you're dictating the tempo and they're failing to adjust, like the way you guys on Paris ran the bunker variation that gladiators made or popularized, like that looked very good. So like really these games just come down to a lot of adjustments and a lot of clutch plays. Same thing I think in the runaway game. Your village was very close. Sanctum, you guys brought out I think a triple DPS variant or something of the sort. But obviously if you lose the first fight, then you're putting yourself in a position where you have to swap the whole comp. That gamble works, you probably 100-0, right? Like it just really comes down to those little things.
Yeah, yeah, and that's also what's cool about it is like in NA Contenders, it kind of felt like you could make mistakes and you could get away with winning series. And one of my favorite seasons to play in was Contender Season 2 because it felt like that season everybody was in Philadelphia, everybody on the uni, except our coach at the time, Pagion, wasn't. He was still in Korea, but it really felt like we just played clean Overwatch for the entire season. We dropped like 2 or 3 maps in the regular season, and then we blew through playoffs, and we ended up 4-0ing XL2 in like the fastest BO7 ever played in Overwatch. And like that season really felt like we were super clean. We always had good plans. We knew what we wanted to do. We were very prepared. Um, but there have definitely been times where it feels like we're making mistakes and still winning.
Mhm.
And that can be a bad habit to get into. You don't want to get into the habit of like, oh, well, I can go for this super risky play here because even if I die, my team will carry and I'll win or something like that. So it's definitely, I think, a better atmosphere to be improving in where if you make those little mistakes, you do get punished and you do lose matches.
Yeah, and it does
It
feel.
kind of helps.
Yeah, go on.
It helps remind you that like regardless of what's happening in the match, you always have to be making the best decision and doing your best to win the fight rather than when you're up like 3-0 or 2-0, just like getting careless about it.
Mhm. I mean, it also feels like teams are just a little more well drilled. I do feel like there's still, the infrastructure part we talked about. I think there's still quite a few decent coaches over there. Especially, I do think a lot of coaches in Korea actually have that mindset where they don't want to go to the league too early. I certainly know that they want the correct. A lot of them want the correct situation, or they want to come with it, because that's what you saw in this season. A lot of coaches came in with cores from their teams, and I think a lot of the coaches in Korea take pride in that, like bringing these guys up, then grabbing them and coming in as a package into the league. I think that's definitely a thing from what I've seen, and from talking to Korean coaches, it seems like that's part of the thought process as well.
I think it's super important too. Like a good example is if you look at the Valiant roster for the stage and you ask somebody who you think is a star player on that roster, like nobody's going to say that someone's top 1 in their role on that Valiant
Yep.
roster. And nobody's going to say that they even maybe think some of the players are top 5 in their role. And Overwatch is such like a dynamic game that's not what matters. Like what matters is how your team works through adversity over time, especially in Overwatch League when it's so long. So like I think Valiant have actually been a great example of that, where no one on their team is necessarily best in their role. Nobody is like some standout carry player that they rely on every fight, but like over time they're just consistent and they're good, and that leads them to wins. And I think that that's one of the reasons you see coaches bring over players they have experience with, is because you kind of know how a player works in those adverse situations, and you can just coach them better because you've experience with them when it comes down to it.
Yeah, and there was definitely like a mayhem package heading there, and you're getting a couple of starters. That's what I thought as well. That Shax would probably earn himself a starting spot. I didn't think it would be this way, that the meta would turn more towards running 3 DPS players and having these flexible compositions. But I definitely saw him potentially starting and helping that team turn around. I never thought they would do something like this, where you go from 0-7 to where they are now. Like, just obviously lost to the Shock today, but still making it to the semifinals of a stage. It's actually an insane turnaround. And what you say is very interesting, because I've always sort of thought that, well, still to kind of be a title contender, you probably need like top 5 players in most positions. Or if you don't have a top 5 player in another position, like say you have the best player in one position, there can be a little bit of you can have a worse player in another position, but overall, like it feels like it sort of has to average out around top 5 for each position, and then you bring the synergy, and then you can beat the guys who have the best players anyway. But Valiant are kind of, they kind of debunk that theory almost, because they, like you say, it feels, well, you could make an argument for Karib. I think Karib's impact has been so insane that,
Yeah, he's been amazing.
yeah, but for the rest of the players, like, it's really just a unit that has come together. And the article that Yiska wrote was great about the team culture that they established, and how everyone's coming in with a selfless attitude. And if you actually buy into that as a team, then like that's the result. Like, no one is sulking. Players on the bench are the first ones to run out and congratulate the players when they make such a paramount achievement in terms of being the first team to beat Vancouver in what was it, like 1.5 years, right? It's definitely awesome to see that.
And I think Titans also benefit from it greatly. Like, they came in having experience on GOATs, being a team, like not even a core. They were a full team pretty much for so long that, like, even if individually some of them aren't the best in their role, it doesn't matter, because the team environment and the team they're in lets them play like they're the best in there.
Yeah.
Because it's like, even if in like the grand scheme of things, Bumper doesn't always make like the 100% best play, his teammates all know he's going to do that. His teammates all know what he's going to be doing. So it's like, doing something that's like suboptimal together is almost always going to be better than one person trying to do like the perfect play. And I think the Titans are like the embodiment of that mentality, at least.
Yeah, and that you expect that that's going to happen. So rather than when he jumps in, rather than going, oh, Bumper's feeding again, I guess we lose this fight, they take an advantage elsewhere on the map, right? Because they know it's going to happen. It's part of their play style. It's part of their DNA.
Yeah, and it's also like how New York play is. Mono never dies.
Yeah.
Like, it's a very weird discrimination against New York, because it feels like you can never all in him and you can never kill him.
Yeah.
And Shock kind of play the same way, where it's like, if you all in super, Sinatra's behind you shooting you in the back, and it's not great. So I think that it's just something that comes with time of teams playing together, and that for newer teams coming in, or even newer coaches coming in, it just makes sense to bring a core with you, because it kind of gives you a head start on the people who don't, and it also just gives you a head start in your own team, either setting up the culture you want to set up, or just trying to get the team to be as ready as possible when it comes time to play.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because that's definitely something I noted and have thought about and discussed as well, is the fact that I thought that teams, well, if you look at the teams that are doing the best in the league right now, it's mostly teams who were either bringing over a core from season 1 and built around that. So you have that pre-existing synergy and trust dating from last season, and you've just added little pieces around that, or you brought in a core from another team. Shanghai doing very well. They brought in a core. Vancouver, same thing. And the teams that just built from scratch, just took players from everywhere. Like, those are the teams that are a little bit lower down. In the rankings. So it definitely manifesting itself in the standings, I think, this season, this theory at least. So moving on from Valiant, I think we can touch a little bit on the Overwatch League playoffs. So I woke up this morning Obviously, I watch the games the day after because I'm in Europe, so I can't stay up at night and watch them. And I wake up and I see that Vancouver has lost to the Shanghai Dragons. And I also, as soon as
Wonderful match.
I tune into the stream and I see Sinatra playing Reaper, I'm like, okay, this is going to be a fun day to rewatch. So presumably you caught the game. What
Yep,
what happened in that
both.
Vancouver Shanghai game? What was going on?
So Shanghai played mostly Pharah comps with either Mercy Ana Doomfist or Mercy Ana, and they would always play Pharah Sombra plus either solo tank Hammond or Orisa. And it really just seemed like Titans didn't have a good counter comp. They tried playing a lot of quad tank to beat it, which was mildly successful, but obviously they got 4-1, so it wasn't very successful. And then they also tried playing some soldier, which I don't personally think, like, as soon as Shanghai saw the soldier, their brig went Widow and suddenly the soldier was irrelevant. So I think that Shanghai just had answers for the counter comps that they had expected, and Titans didn't have any good ideas of what they could be playing really into it. Like, Titans definitely looked unprepared to play against that many DPS in that match. One sec. I'm going to go to the bathroom. We'll be back in like 35 seconds. Okay, I'm back. Sorry about that.
Welcome back. No
Did you
problem.
get to catch the second match, which was Valiant vs. Shock at all?
I caught the last two maps and didn't seem very competitive. And I was preparing for the pod, so I wasn't really paying attention that much. But I saw Sinatra on the Reaper, and they were running these funky comps. Rascal was on the Hog, so that's pretty much what I saw.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was interesting. It seemed like, so obviously Shock have like this Baptist goat style that isn't really played by any other team anywhere, which is kind of interesting. And Valiant tried to counter it by playing Moira goats, which I think, in my personal opinion, might be like one of the worst ways to counter it, because you're giving up the ability to like burst people for the sustained healing, but BAP just has more sustained healing than you do.
Yeah.
So it's one of those things where I don't want to jump to a conclusion. Like, I'm sure they had their reasons that were thought out, but it'd be interesting just to hear why they wanted to play that comp, because to me, at least, it doesn't seem like a good match.
Yeah, it feels like you're losing all the trades as well beyond the sustain. Like, you can't burst anyone. You have the mortality field as an extra cushion. The ultimate is, I think, better than Moira's ultimate, especially in goats versus goats matchups. But I think a big thing with the Shock is the fact that we're gonna get back to Shanghai, but the big thing with Shock is like they're the best team, because you saw how much Vancouver struggled against DPS compositions. Granted, Shanghai maybe is a little bit better at those compositions, but then again, Valiant beat Shanghai playing their own game, right? So Valiant are extremely good with these compositions, but Shock feels like they're the best equipped to handle this resurgence of DPS, with having Rascal being the best Batiste in the world, presumably, right?
Yeah, I played a bit of Baptist. Like, I played it in both series on Paris, and it's a very strong hero. It's one of those heroes where you feel like you can solo carry fights almost. Because it's like, if they're playing a Pharah comp and you just happen to hit 3 headshots on Mercy, she's suddenly like 40 HP and any more damage kills her. So if you can aim on the hero and you're like pretty good game sense about when you use your immortality field and when you use your shift, you can do a lot of it also must be a lot more free in the goats comp, I think, than in the bunker comps, because in the bunker comps 90% of what you have to do is pocket a bastion.
Yeah.
Whereas in the goats comps, obviously he's like more of a ranged DPS. But Valiant today didn't really play any DPS comps. I was kind of surprised by it. It felt like they were a lot of the times trying to mirror on goats, and I feel like if you're going to play against Shock, that's like the one thing you don't want to. I think if you mirror Shock on goats, your chances of winning are almost non-existent. They're already so good at that comp that like it feels like you're just playing catch up by like 4 months almost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, it felt like a lot of people discounted Shock, because I sort of agree. I tend to agree, but I also think they are very well equipped to handle those DPS compositions with Batiste that no one else is. But yeah, I think everyone was kind of quick to count Shock out. You know, they dropped a couple of games. They didn't look as dominant as Stage 2, and everyone was ready for someone else to kind of take the crown. But once again, they show that they're, and they brought out a couple of those weird compositions on Volskaya with the Reaper, right?
Yeah.
So they had something special up their sleeve. Something I actually want to ask you, since we're on the topic of Batiste, because I made a note of this as well. When you guys were playing Havana against Runaway, it felt like they made the adjustment. Let me think. So they made the adjustment on second point against on their defense, swapping to that Batiste. But I'm trying to remember. There was something special about it in terms of
It was
the
the main support who went
exact.
Batiste.
Yes. So
Like gave up the Lucio, yeah.
yeah, and I was wondering what you thought about that because I feel like when I saw that, I was like, wow, that's actually pretty smart because of how the map is with these little high grounds and how much
I think it
value
just
you can
has a
get out of
lot
the
to do with
mortality
how you want
field.
to play.
Yeah,
Like if you're playing Sombra, I think the Lucio speed for the Ana, it's really if you're playing Zen or if you're playing Ana. And if you're playing Zen, you're probably playing Diva with it, unless you're starting Zen defense with Sombra Goats, which isn't super popular. I think
yeah,
Runaway are one of the few teams that do that. Um, and Runaway in their most recent match showed Rhine, Zarya, Orisa with Bap, Zen, Lucio, and they on defense Havana, and they played like this super bunker
yeah,
contest point forever. That was pretty interesting. Um, and I think that Havana is one of the maps where it's like no one's really sure what's best yet because it's still such a new map, and a lot of the comps that have been winning are like cookie cutter comps. Like you just play Somber Goats because Somber
yeah,
Goats is good. You just play Rhine Goats because it's good. And that the actual best comp I don't think has really been figured out yet.
yeah.
So I'm excited. Like if that ends up being the meta, I'm hyped for that. I love playing back. Um, but it's definitely cool to see teams experimenting with what they can play on the map.
Yeah, especially on defense, it felt like it was such a because you're playing these little high grounds. High ground is very difficult to retake on that map when you're the attacking team, and even then, like you guys pretty much had it. It felt like you could have closed that second point against a runaway, but then the immortality field just clutched so many fights. Where like you
Yeah.
guys should have had like 3 kills. The immortality field delays that, and then they kind of clutch it. But
I
Batiste,
mean,
yeah,
it's an incredible ability.
yeah, it
Like
is.
the number of outplays you can do with it are crazy. You know, like your Batiste hides from grab. A good example is an R match on Paris. I think that they went to Nano Blade, and after the first swipe, you put down Immortality Field, and then he has to swipe the field and then swipe the Bastion again, and you're adding
Yeah,
5 seconds to the Bastion's life,
yeah.
which is so much time to give him to kill the Genji. So
Oh.
I'm a little concerned about its balance overall, but not many teams are playing it, so it's kind of hard to judge.
Mm-hmm. So going back to Shanghai, because obviously their run in these playoffs has been the thing that's been most impressive. You know, beating NYXL and beating Vancouver. I'm not sure how the how close the Vancouver game was, but you know NYXL they look pretty confident against them. Obviously, could have still gone either way. NYXL could have easily lost 3-0, but could have also turned it around. What do you make of this run by Shanghai?
That teams can't one trick goats, and I think that's awesome.
Mm-hmm.
I think that Shanghai are kind of showing that if you're a team that's only going to play goats, they're going to beat you, and you have to be able to play either triple DPS mirrors or some 2-2-2 comp that's going to counter what they're doing. At least in Korean contenders, that triple DPS comp is very prevalent. Almost every Koth map, one team plays it. Almost every first point attack, somebody plays it. It's like a super common, and it leads to a lot of cool situations on defense where like you end up on Widow Sombra 2-2-2 with like Monkey Diva Lucio Ana and a comp probably no Owl team has even played. Just because it's like teams are trying to adapt in the middle of maps to try to beat this. Or like if you're in a DPS comp mirror, what heroes are you swapping to get an advantage? Like Shanghai, for instance, have this cool tech where they put their third DPS to Brig on retakes to make sure that they can actually get to either a high ground or some position they can hold with the Brig. And that, for instance, isn't something that's done in Korea. And that's like a cool tech thing that I haven't seen at least. Whereas here you see a lot of the Pharah goes Tracer, and then you have like this Widow Tracer Sombra Hammond like quad dive, and you have like this Mercy Ana that's kind of like playing back with the Widow and trying to stay alive in the middle of fights. So it's like I really like it because it's adding diversity when I feel like the first 3 stages have been very stagnant in terms of meta. Um, so I hope it gives Vancouver a lesson that they can't just play triple tank comps and try to get away with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's interesting because if you think about it, if you think about how do we beat Shanghai Dragons, you can look at one, you can look at the Valiant game, but you can look at a more recent example, which is the Guangzhou game, where Guangzhou did a mix of things. They threw a lot of different looks at them. They did that triple tank with the Hog, Winston, Diva on Village. They made that work. They also threw a lot of DPS mirrors into them and actually managed to beat them Happy obviously being an insane
Yep.
Widow as well. So they show that depending on the map, you have to adapt, and that's how you beat them. And a team like Guangzhou, no one would put them anywhere close to where Vancouver is, right? Considering the
Yeah.
standings, but they had the correct game plan going into it, and they knew how to play these things. Whereas I did see in the highlights that Vancouver at some point was playing that Guangzhou comp as well, but you've probably never played it, right? Like who's on
Yeah,
what? You have
or you've
Huxel on the
scrimmed it
Diva,
1 or 2 times,
yeah. So
and you
yeah,
haven't played it enough to be proficient.
yeah, so you've probably never played it on that map. You've just seen, oh, this comp probably works, and it worked on Village, but it worked on Village for specific reasons. It's not as open. It's a lot easier to just play off point pressure. A little bit harder to do that, presumably on Volskaya. Again, I haven't watched the match. I don't want to draw conclusions, but your Haxel has never played Diva, and obviously, if you feel like the comp isn't that big of a counter like Guangzhou did, they put Happy on the Diva, who also doesn't have experience, but they made it work because they had a strong hog. So do you have a super strong hog, or you're just picking into that comp because you feel like that's the counter, but the players aren't proficient enough to execute that? It's is that a fire alarm?
No, that is a doorbell.
Oh, okay, gotcha. So
Okay, good.
another interesting angle with Shanghai is that I think someone in chat asked as well, that I was wondering as well. Can anyone else do what Shanghai has done, or is it only Shanghai
Totally.
that can do this?
Yes, 100% other teams can do it. I mean, obviously you need a good Pharah player. Like that's probably the single most important thing for that comp, is because the Pharah player is versus most things, like versus Goats comps, the Pharah player is like 80% of your carry potential. Like she has
Yeah.
to do almost all the hero plays. Everybody else is kind of just like buying time and displacing people and hoping she hits her directs. But against in like DPS mirrors, the Pharah is almost not doing much. Like generally what happens a lot of the time is, at least in Korean contenders meta, in the DPS mirrors, both Pharaohs just instantly swap, because playing Pharah against Widow just feels terrible. You feel like you have no control over sight lines and you're not really doing much. So both Pharaohs go Tracer, and then you're in like this dive with triple DPS where it's entirely on like mid-fight communication for targets and like dive coordination, which is super different than any other comp you could be playing, right? Like if you're playing Goats, there's not like there's mid-fight communication, sure, but there's no like dives and there's no like split pushes in the same sense, where you have like a Tracer Sombra clearing right side and a Hammond going point and your support's going left side with the Widow. And then just I don't know. That's like a really cool dynamic that I feel like has evolved from this comp, but teams needed to start playing it earlier. I don't think like
Mm-hmm.
if we see Shock show up with the comp versus Shanghai, they're going to do particularly well.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, and it definitely makes sense, because if you're making that swap, if you're getting Ding off of Farah, if you can force him off of Farah and onto Tracer, you win. Like you're just winning, because he, from what I know, doesn't play Tracer. Certainly doesn't have the reps, and
Yeah.
he is the super carry of the Dragons. But yeah, I do think you do have to have a very strong Farah to make it work against the compositions that are prevalent in Overwatch League. I also think the reason we don't really see it as much is because teams aren't as willing to gamble with a shorter season, with fewer games.
Yeah.
You just want to play it safe, which is why most meta changes stem from contenders historically for the last year. Like that's where the meta changes come out. Clockwork Vendetta came in and they're dominating EU contenders. Now you can see some Clockwork Vendetta in OWL, and some teams running it to decent success. Toronto had 2 full holds with that composition. So, um, yeah, that's probably why you don't see as many changes in OWL. So, what's your take on the finals then? Shock against Dragons, because like you said, Shock. So very different clash of styles here. Obviously, you have a capable team in Shock who can play a lot of different things, but they also haven't played a lot of triple DPS. We just kind of established that, well, maybe you do have to play a lot of DPS to really get Dink off of that Pharah. What do you make of that matchup?
So I haven't watched much of stage 3, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
I've maybe seen 2 or 3 games at most, other than the playoffs, just because like the time zone with being Korea
Yeah.
just is not feasible. Um, so I was very surprised today. I went on a Vast stream earlier and was talking to him, and he thought Valiant were gonna win, and I was super confused. I was like, aren't Shock just the best team like in the league right now, pretty much, other than like maybe Titans? And I think that Shock, especially in playoffs, are gonna be the dominant team.
Yeah.
Like I think even if Dragons in the regular season may have beaten Shock playing the DPS stuff, that like in a BO7, Shock are gonna win. They
Yeah.
have so much more experience in Dragons in these playoffs. It's literally their third in a row. So I think Shock will 4-2, maybe 4-3.
Yeah.
Shock, in my opinion, should win all of their map picks
Yeah.
since it's loser picks.
Yeah.
And hopefully they can eke out one win on Koth. That would be my main concern, is I think Dragons are a lock to win the two Koth maps,
Mm-hmm.
just because DPS are so much stronger than most other options there. Um, but I have faith in Shock. I still think they're the best team right now.
But
Yeah.
that's also a thing with best of seven sets is that you don't have to win both Koths usually. I mean,
Yeah.
Koth and best of fives or in regular season games. If you go to map 5, you have to win it, which means 40% of the map pool is Koth. Whereas in the best of 7, you can afford to even lose them and still bring it back on the other map. So that's like another advantage that I think Shock has beyond just being more seasoned, beyond like actually having good plans against them, and really. I think they're going to be well prepared. So I do feel like the Shock is going to take it as well. But who knows? Maybe it's a Cinderella run by Shanghai. Maybe Ding continues to pop off. I mean, there's definitely things that he can do that I've never seen people do, like in terms of being that clean on the Pharah.
Yeah.
So it's definitely
His Pharah is arguably one of the best in Overwatch League, if
yeah.
not the best.
Yeah, I do think it's probably the best. Obviously, we haven't seen as many people play it. No one's really brought it to the board, whereas he's been grinding it the whole season. It's kind of like, well, it's among the best ball in Overwatch League. Well, he's
It's like, well,
played
we just
it
don't see enough Ammons.
exactly, so it's difficult to say. But so moving on from Owl players, I think where we can end this is looking forward into a next stage, because something that obviously not confirmed, just hypothetical rumors that the Overwatch League might go into 2-2-2. So hypothetically speaking, what are your thoughts on that decision, were it to be made?
I'd be super surprised. Really. One, we've seen such diversity this stage, especially in the season playoffs, where you've seen a lot of 2-2-2 comps, you've seen a lot of triple DPS comps, you've seen that Goats is very easily beatable by a lot of these comps. So I'd be surprised if that ends up happening. But I mean, I guess we'll see. I don't really know what any meta would look like if you could only play two heroes of each role. My guess is you'd see a lot of bunker, because Orisa Ha, like right now the bunker comps end up being 2-2-2. So it would be like Orisa Hog or Orisa Diva with like Bap Ana or Bap Mercy. I have some concerns for, I guess, what heroes would see less playtime, right? Like Brig probably never sees
No,
playtime in that
Brig
world.
is dead in 2-2-2.
Yeah. I think it definitely changes the way a lot of heroes would be viewed. Um, I think it would be interesting, and it would be like new and kind of cool to see at first, but I don't know. Again, I'm like really skeptical it's gonna happen,
Mm-hmm.
but I do think it would be interesting. Like everything would get shaken up, which would
Yeah.
always be cool. You get to see what teams are best at adapting on the fly, kind of. So
Yeah, but that's also one of the arguments against it, is that you have had this season, you have had these two dominant forces in Shock and Titans, who are still, granted Titans lost now, but they're still a top 4 team, and you're just completely fundamentally changing the game, how the game works 3 quarters into the season, right? Like that, from a competitive integrity standpoint, that's not really fair on those teams, right?
um yeah, I don't know if I care too much about that aspect of it though. Like I think the best teams in Overwatch are the teams that have to be adapting all the time on the fly. Like I don't want a team to win Overwatch League because they could play one comp better than every other team. So I'm not really, I wouldn't be too upset if I saw like hero bans or 2-2-2 lock come into Overwatch League, and then it's like suddenly Titans are not the best team, and suddenly they're like mid-table because they have to adapt
Mm-hmm.
to new comps. Like while that might suck for them and they might feel pretty bad about it, I think that getting through Overwatch League, being able to do the same thing all season, shouldn't be expected. And it'd be maybe kind of interesting if you could rebalance stage playoffs to be more rewarding, and then have bigger changes between stages, possibly, so that like you can kind of prove that in this meta we're dominant, and that gives us some extra qualification to make playoffs. And then in this meta, we're not so good and we have a bad map record, but because we like won stage one, it doesn't matter that we don't do great in the other three metas. That come playoffs, we're still qualified and we can focus on that. But I do get why as a team and as a player you'd be kind of annoyed
Yeah.
by it. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, you just obviously like if you are winning, it's going to be annoying. But I mean, it's a reasonable take um, from the perspective of like Overwatch for the longest time has been about adaptation, and we've seen a lot of historic teams throughout the years rise and fall with meta changes. You know, NIP historically an exceptional three tank team. As soon as three tank isn't viable, half the team retires. You know what I mean? It's kind of that's not what you want the Overwatch League to be or Overwatch to be. Players who, if this doesn't work, we're done. Like we're not gonna be able to adapt. You want flexibility. You want players because that's how you build up superstars, right? Like if the meta changes and one player can't play anymore, well, you're losing a lot of the viewership as well, right? That's what kind of goats I suppose did, but at the same time you had to adapt the goats, but then there hasn't been a change since then, which is what people were starving for. But now we have that change, and now potentially we get the 2-2. So it feels like that if this happened
Yeah.
before stage 3, everyone would have been more on board with it. But now it almost feels like, oh, do we do it? Do we not? It's a bit weird, right?
So I think some upsides of a hypothetical 2-2 lock are job security long term for
Yeah,
players. I think that's one huge aspect of it that as a player I like just objectively because it's kind of weird to say to somebody like Carpe is an example.
yeah,
Amazing hit scan player. The
yeah,
start of the season, hey Carpe, please play this role you've never played at
yeah,
an Overwatch League level right now. And Carpe's still doing great on it. But it's like he should be thinking like I'm practicing DPS heroes. I am a DPS player. These are the heroes I'm going to be playing. And I know that with my other DPS partner, we're going to divide up those heroes so we can both be very proficient at some things. Whereas I don't like the fact where too much flexibility almost feels like it can invalidate some of those things. Like you probably won't see the best Widow plays of all time in a Goats meta, even when Widow's played, because people don't have those like thousands of hours on
yeah.
Widow that are like so fresh and practice ready. Um, but again, as you said, like we just saw so much diversity that I don't think a 2-2-2 lock is necessary in
Mm-hmm.
Overwatch League. There's
Mm-hmm.
so much diversity right now in this stage, I feel like, and just in contenders at least cross regionally.
Yeah. I mean, it's what you say about Carper. Like, he's doing great, but at the same time, if he does get to play what he's actually practiced his whole career, he is a player who can carry. He's an MVP level player who can carry any game, right? So it's still,
Yeah.
in terms of overall impact that you can have, you'd rather have the players who have practiced for 3 years on certain heroes to actually go on the stage and display what they've learned or what the skills that they've acquired. Um, so yeah, I mean, it does definitely add job security. Another thing that I think it potentially has is to maybe make the ranked experience a little more enjoyable. What's your take on how ranked would change? If because presumably I don't see a world where 2-2 is implemented in ranked, but then I mean sorry in Overwatch League, but then doesn't actually happen in ranked because you're facing the same issue where well now you have two different environments, you're watching two different games. It's very difficult to get behind as a viewer, I think.
Yeah, I agree that would be weird. My assumption is any game change would be to the game and not just to Overwatch League.
Yeah.
Um, I know that like other esports like Rainbow Six Siege added operator or like essentially hero bans into their pro scene a while before they were in ranked just because they weren't sure how to balance them and if they'd actually have the same intended impact that they did
Yeah.
in the pro scene. Um, I think that would be beneficial, especially I think it'd be almost more beneficial for ranked than it would be for Overwatch League just because like as a support player, there's like a couple roles I can play competently at like 4600 SR. And that's like support and that's a couple DPS heroes. But if you ask me to play main tank, like I'm probably 4100 at main tank,
Yeah.
maybe 4200 on a
Mhm.
good day. So like it kind of sucks when you get in like a 4500 SR game and it's like, okay, you're playing main tank and your team is greatly handicapped because of this. So I would like roll queue for comp very much just for that reason. Because it also lets you like, if I want to play main tank, maybe the role queue could decide, okay, you are 4100 SR on main tank. We're going to put you in a game as if you're that SR, and then you can actually play with people who are around the same skill level on that role, rather than feeling like anytime I try to play main tank, I just get completely destroyed if I'm playing against like Muma or Fact Fiction and
Mm,
Comp, just because clearly I'm worse than them. So the
yeah.
fact that I'm in a game with them trying to match that main tank role is just not great.
Yeah, that would be probably pretty hard to execute, though, in terms of okay, you have an SR attached to a specific hero or a specific role, but I guess if it's only three roles, if it's only tanks, DPS, and supports, then it's maybe feasible, right? Because if you lock in a certain SR,
Yeah.
you have a separate
I
one.
mean, like, okay, so in a magical world where I had control of everything,
Yeah.
I would make there be three separate SRs, one for each role, and change the golden gun rewards to be locked to those roles, probably, because, like, why not? And then add champion skins for those roles. And then you get the champion skin if you end, like, top 500
Mm.
as support, or, like, top 500 as DPS. And then when you check someone's career profile, when it shows the season, it could just show three numbers at the top with, like, three seasonal peaks or something like
Mm.
that. But I do think it's hard to implement a 2-2-2 lock in uh, comp without changing the SR system personally, because at that point, like, sure, you might be able to queue for the role you want, or even if you sorry, let's say you can't queue for the role you want, right? Let's say you queue for a game and it's 2-2-2 lock, but it's still six random players. I think that might almost be worse.
Mm.
Because if you get a game, like I've had games on West Coast where it's like me, Moth, Pooks, and like Swimmer, and we have four main support players.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, we can play goats and we can all competently play the game so we can still win.
Yeah.
But if you had to say like, okay, two of you are playing supports and two of you have to play DPS, probably won't do as well. Just because like we're all more familiar with what we're doing in the roles of goats. So I think a role queue would have to be with the 2-2-2 lock if you're going to put it into comp.
Yeah. I
And
mean,
then I'm
it
not sure
has
how
to
you'd
be. Yeah.
balance the SR, but
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, definitely because obviously, I mean, unless you're trolling with what you're queuing as, you would avoid those scenarios, which is something something that it makes the experience more enjoyable because you just exclude those games. But obviously, it hits the hits the competitive, I guess, diversity. Maybe that's a good word for it, where like you're just limited in the things that you can run, and we saw just how much fun
yeah.
this stage was in terms of everyone making adjustments, everyone running different things, but also like from a balancing perspective, it has been sort of proven that it's very difficult for Blizzard to figure out how to balance the game. But is that really the issue, or is it the issue that the schedule is so hectic that teams don't have time to experiment? Because the patch, stage 3 patch, almost identical to stage 2, like nothing really changed. But we've seen a pretty big meta shift, and that's because teams started experimenting. We've seen other teams in contenders bring stuff up, and that other teams are trying it in Overwatch League, right? It's just like everything takes longer to be implemented, right? So
Yeah,
it feels like it's kind
that's an
of like,
interesting point.
yeah, it feels like it's very easy to get into this mindset of the grass is greener on the other side of a 2-2, where like everything's going to be better. But I think it also brings a lot of problems to the table.
I I think objectively, I would never be in favor of a 2-2-2 lock, but I think right now the game is in a really weird spot as far as like what heroes are good. And yes, we've seen diversity this stage, but there's no telling that that's just the GOATS teams have yet to adapt to
Yeah,
beating it. Like you kind of saw DPS in stage 1 and you saw the GOATS teams like Shock played their BAP and Titans played their Ana Winston dive, and like they still played 3-3 and ended up just beating the DPS teams. It just took them time to like find the comps that actually did it. So my concern would be if in stage 4 we're in the same meta on the same patch and it just turns out that there is a counter, it's just a slight tweak in the
yeah,
3-3-3 comp to suddenly counter.
hmm
So I guess that might be a failing on balancing
yeah,
more so than a failing on like letting people pick whatever hero or however many number of heroes they want. Um, but I do think that like one of the easiest solutions to that I can think of, rather than like every week trying to like fine tune each hero's balancing, is add a 2-2-2 lock. Like most games have some wider feature that you can balance around. Like most games have hero bans, for instance.
hmm
Like a good example is in Rainbow Six Siege, they have operator bans or hero bans, and the best team in the world banned the same operator every single match they played for like 4 months. And every single match they banned the same person. And then the devs went, okay, well, clearly this operator's broken. If the best team in the world is winning all the major championships, banning the same person every single map. Like, clearly something must be wrong. So they removed the hero from competitive play, completely reworked them, and then released them again. And now they're in a much healthier state. And I think that it just helps developers to have that kind of like framework to be able to balance around, where you get like much more direct feedback from the pro community about what
Yeah.
is and isn't broken. Because there are teams right now saying like, well, Brig is overpowered, and it's like, okay, but these comps without Brig are still winning a vast majority of their fights. So are you saying that like Brig and Pharah are overpowered? Are you saying that like Winston and Ana together are overpowered? Like, for me, if I'm a developer trying to listen to the pro Overwatch community, I feel like there's so many different messages about what is and isn't broken that like it would be easier to implement something like hero bans or role lock and then balance around those when you see like what actually has the most playtime in those situations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean it's what you say is like from a balancing perspective is just so difficult because you're not only because best example being Brig, like we said, very strong in an unlocked meta, in a 2-2 meta, probably completely useless just because of how the game works, because there's nothing she does better without mobility, because she's stagnant, right? If you need mobility, you put in Lucy, okay, you have no heals. If you're playing a slow comp,
You
there's
probably
so many
want
heroes.
Mercy.
Yeah, like there's 4 heroes that can do that job better than her, right? So from a balancing perspective, it's just so difficult because you're not really balancing around a hero, you're balancing around the synergies. But then if you hit a hero too much, like, because they've hit Brig so many times, but it's still like the synergy. The problem isn't the fact that Brig is, well, I mean, she's kind of a P. Rally is super strong, but it's more so how she synergizes in 3 support setups where you just have so much sustain. Like, that's the problem. You pressure the objective, you have the sustain. That's why Brig is strong. And with the 2-2 lock, I mean, it's just easier for them to do it unless you implement bans, in which case the teams can themselves actually balance the game, and then you can work around that. But do you feel, because other people have brought up bans, but do you feel like there has to be more heroes for bans to be viable, or do you think that doesn't matter? You can just start with 1 ban, then maybe move up to 2 when there's more heroes, because that's I think what League of Legends did. They had 3 bans in the beginning, they added 50 new heroes, now there's 5 bans. So
Yeah, I was talking to Siegel about this because I thought he had one of the better takes on it, and it's adding bans is objectively better for the game health, not only because it helps devs see how to balance and who's broken, um, but it also the downsides people think of when they think of bans, like, oh well, what if a team bans like 2 important heroes, like let's say Mercy and Lucio, then you're gonna have to play Ana Zen, and it's like, well, most teams aren't gonna choose to do that. Like in Overwatch League, teams aren't going to be trolling with their bans to ban 2 important heroes that are needed. Like maybe you see a Mercy ban because one team plays a lot of Pharah, and it's like, okay, well that kind of takes out that
yep.
strategy, but the other team's not going to then say like, okay, well we're going to ban Lucio, so you have to play Anazen on this map. Like that's an unrealistic expectation to have on bans. What is going to happen is you're going to see more like targeted bans used against teams against certain strategies, and I think that will develop metas in really cool ways.
Yeah.
And it will also add permanent diversity.
Yeah.
Because you're not just having like either like a goats matchup on this map and then a DPS matchup on this map, and it's like, okay, whenever a team plays King's Row, you expect to see goats or somber goats on both sides for the entirety of it.
Mm-hmm.
You could just say like, okay, well on King's Row this time we're going to ban Reinhardt, right? Because we don't want to have that matchup. So now we're going to have like either a dive matchup or like a sniper matchup, which is cool and unique and you generally wouldn't get to see. So
Yeah.
I think hero bans would be great, although again, implementing them seems horrifically terrible. So good luck to whoever's job that is,
Yeah.
I guess.
Yeah, but I agree. It would make things very interesting, but it will also make practice a lot harder, because you would never really be able in scrims to practice a single composition for too long. You would have to go, okay, we're practicing this on this day, we're practicing this on another day, and I think practice actually for Overwatch League teams would be hell, because you might prepare a composition, but well, they banned Reinhardt, now we can't play goats, we have to play something completely different. But then it's definitely interesting, but implementation would be hard, and it would probably be hard on the teams. But it would create, I think, a lot more parity, because you could take teams out of their comfort matchups. You're going up against Shanghai, where we'll take in the Pharah out of there, and what are you going to do? Or you're going up against a really good Widow player who maybe doesn't have a hero pool beyond that. Well, we're banning your Widow. What are you going to do now, right? Like, it would be
And
pretty interesting.
again, it goes back to like my philosophy where I don't think a team should be able to get by doing one thing, right? Like I think the coolest teams are the teams that can adapt to
Yeah.
each meta and each match and play different stuff and still come out on top. So I'm not really as concerned no matter how hard it is on the teams, just because like it's not like one team is disproportionately advantaged in this setup. Like every team is hit in the same way, so you're still seeing who the best team is. You're just kind of changing the circumstances for what makes the best team.
Mm-hmm. And I think it adds a little more depth to the game as well in terms of preparation pre-game. It makes everything way more complex, and it makes analysis of the game, I think, more fun. You know, right now on the desk, it's like, well, they played these comps, they played these comps, that's it. But if you're adding bans into the fold, there's so many more angles you can take. There's so many, like the game becomes so much more complex because there's so many more mind games. Why are they banning this? What's the point of this? How did they, it just makes the game more interesting, I think. Yeah. Whereas 2-2 kind of, well, let's put it this way. If the Overwatch League would go 2-2 for stage 4, do you think there's a way back to just revert it back for the next season, or do you think it's kind of too big and too fundamental of a change if they would implement that in ranked for that to change anytime soon?
One thing I really like about Blizzard's dev team is they're not scared to go like we're wrong on something. So whether or not it comes out in stage 4, whether or not they try it in the off season or even the start of next season, I'm sure if it's something that the like majority of the community doesn't like, they wouldn't hesitate being like, okay, we get it, we're wrong, we're gonna try something else. And I have faith in them to do that. But I don't. I still be really like all my talks with people who have like spoken with the dev team and their public stuff is they like one of the core aspects of Overwatch is the ability to freely swap heroes. So
Yeah.
it would really surprise me if it came in, especially because there's been so much diversity. Like I feel like even if that was a decision that was made, you'd have to reconsider it after seeing the playoffs of this stage.
Yeah, and I mean to that point as well. Like I guess because going into like during mid-season, I was like, there's no way Blizzard would ever implement 2-2 mid-season. But the fact like the rumors have been so rampant proves that, well, there must have been a serious discussion there at least. So they are considering adding it mid-season. So if they are considering adding it mid-season, then presumably if it was objectively the wrong call and they realized that somewhere down the road, they wouldn't hesitate to immediately flip that. So yeah, I think actually the fact that there's actual rumors of this happening, it does make sense that it's part of their philosophy. Just okay, let's try this, see if it's healthy for the game. The one hero lock was certainly healthy for the game when everyone was playing 5 tracers. That wasn't very fun. So maybe 2-2 is amazing and it's the best thing for the game. Maybe it's not, and then you can change things up. So it'll definitely be interesting to see how the philosophy and everything develops.
Yeah, I think the other aspect of it is like when you choose to do something like that, like a big patch change, they're gonna probably stick with any patch change for at least a stage.
Yeah.
So, and it seems weird to change the patch only for the final playoffs. So my expectation is whatever patch we go into stage 4 with, we're getting for the season playoffs. So I mean, regardless of what we see, I'm pretty sure it was like that last season.
Was it?
I'm
not sure. Maybe it was. I don't remember. I wasn't in the playoffs, so I didn't pay attention to patches as much.
Fair.
But it might have been. Yeah.
I'm more okay with a change going into stage 4 than I would be a change going into the overall playoffs.
Yeah.
Because I think that once you get out of stage 4, it's kind of like at that point, the patch should remain relatively the same.
Yeah, especially if you have these stories of teams coming back from, meta changes, stage 4, they're really good, they make it into the playoffs, then that's a compelling story that you want to follow through in the playoffs, I think. Say Valiant right now, like they're surging back, say they have another strong stage and they come back into the playoffs. What if it flips again and they're bad again in the playoffs? Like that's not a very compelling story. So yeah, I agree for narrative's sake, for competition's sake, it just makes most sense to keep it consistent. I do believe like the meta didn't really change. It changed, I think, from stage 3 to stage 4, but not from stage 4 to playoffs. It was pretty similar. There was still a lot of that triple tank bunker on a lot of different maps. So yeah, it was pretty much the same.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we pretty much covered everything I had. Again, thank you so much for taking the time, coming on here and chatting a little bit about Overwatch, very interesting to hear about Philadelphia Fusion. I think a team that's definitely going to be, especially if the 2-2 ban happens, going to be on the up and up heading into stage 4. If it doesn't, definitely a team to still take seriously heading into the playoffs. Obviously, everyone follow Elk on Twitter, follow his journey in Contenders. Definitely going to be a very, very interesting finish to the season over there in Korean Contenders. Anything can happen, so going to be one of the best ones to watch to date. And thanks for taking the time. And
yeah, no worries, man. Thanks very much for having me. Yeah.
All right.
My Twitter, by the way, is @elk, which is super easy to find. If you can't find it, you're unlike all the people who accidentally at me with Animal Reserve questions.
Yeah, we got it on screen, so those who are viewing should see it. And I was also actually very impressed that you managed to get at Elk. We can probably
Fusion,
maybe end on
awesome
that.
with that.
Yeah, who had Elk before you yoinked it?
So you can only get ats if it's a unactivated account or like a abandoned account, pretty much for like I think 12 months.
Yeah.
And then, or you have to pay for it. Like Sinatra, I think paid for his at. And they can range between like $1,000 to $4,000, which is unreasonably expensive. But Fusion was really cool and got like me Elk. They got Alarm. Beast Halo was kind of memey and asked Fusion to get him the at Halo, but for obvious reasons, that's taken by another company.
Yeah.
I think Zachary got Zachary, so Zerg got Zerg, who was on the Uni team at the time. But Fusion was really great with getting us all the Insta handles we wanted and also the Twitter handles.
So there was no one who had it before. You had to like PM, hey, dude, can I have this? Can I buy this handle off of you?
Yeah, I think that they hadn't tweeted since 2011.
Okay.
So Fusion or Twitter was just like, yeah, that's an inactive account. We'll give you the @ and the check mark, which is wonderful.
I need to look.
I very much appreciate it.
Yeah, I need to look at who has mineral and maybe contact Fusion and see what they can do for me. All right, we'll end it right there. Okay, thank you so much for